Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. I'm Emeritus Professor Glenn McConell from Victoria University in Australia. Today I'm bringing to you Professor Kirsty Elliott-Sale from Manchester Metropolitan University in England. She's an expert on females and exercise performance. So we focus on the effect of the menstrual cycle, oral contraception, pregnancy, and menopause on exercise performance. And as you'll see, despite the world's population obviously being 50% females, a lot less than 50% of the research on exercise performance has been conducted on females. So we can see here there's clearly a lack of investigation and a lack of clarity on the effect of these factors on exercise performance. So there's a lot of opportunity there for research to be done. I think you'll really enjoy this podcast, so stick around. Hi, Kirsty. Thanks for coming on to Inside Exercise. How are you?
I'm really good. Thank you so much for my invitation. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I'm excited too. There's been a lot of interest and excitement on Twitter. Been a lot of, I don't know if you saw that, a lot of retweets and likes and things like that. So it's a good sign that you're a person of interest.
Oh, that could be taken two ways.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about the effect of menstrual cycle, hormonal contraception, pregnancy, and menopause on exercise performance. But what I often ask people is, how did you even get to be this exercise researcher? Quite often people are sort of a sports person to start with, and then they get interested in research, or they're a researcher and then get interested in exercise. So how did you end up getting to where you are now? If you don't mind me asking.
No, I don't at all. Mine was a complete accident, actually. I don't know if you ever saw that film in the 90s, Sliding Doors, where you make one decision and you go down one path or another one, and you have a different parallel life. And that's sort of my story. When I was in Ireland and at secondary school, I had the best PE teacher, physical education teacher ever. She was great. And I love those sessions. And so anyway, I got it into my mind. I wanted to be a PE teacher. You know, you want to be what you can see. And so I applied for PE, lots of different universities, actually a lot in the UK. And I turned up, this is back in the 90s, and so you sometimes had to have an interview at the university in order to get on the course. So I took myself off to Liverpool with my mum for an interview for what I thought was PE. To be a PE teacher. And when I arrived there, I quickly realized that I'd put the next code, because it was all done by code rather than by course title. And I'd actually applied for coaching science degree. So that was the next code to PE. And went for the interview, and they just sold me this course, this coaching science course, which I don't know if it's a universal course, but it's very much like sport and exercise science, but obviously with some specialism in coaching. And I just thought this sounded way better than PE. And so all hopes of being a PE teacher abandoned. So, you know, got offered the position, went to Liverpool John Moores, did a coaching science degree, which might sound like the end of the story, but actually then another sort of sliding doors moment, as they say. When I finished my PhD, when I finished my degree, there were some PhDs advertised, and I thought, I'm just going to put in a proposal. So you could propose whatever you wanted to do. And I wrote actually a proposal around thermoregulation. And put that in, had an interview, offered the position, and then started. And they said, oh yeah, you're not doing thermoregulation at all. We would really like to do some research using women as participants. And actually there had been a fantastic researcher before me at Liverpool John Moores, Julie Greaves, who's published lots in this area, and they wanted me to sort of extend her work. And suddenly, actually, which is quite an interesting point, is that I had never really been taught anything about menstrual cycles, hormonal contraception, anything like that. It's not routinely taught in the curriculum here. Okay, it was the 90s. I think it's still not taught so often now. And so yeah, I did a bit of a crash course in female physiology, and the rest is history. So twice I accidentally fell into where I am. But what I will end this story on is the fact that once I started to look into this area, I was entirely hooked, and I have stayed in this area pretty much exclusively since my PhD in the late 90s. So that's how I fell into it, Glenn, but with zero regrets. And actually, you know, I'm now the biggest geek in this area that you will find.
Well, it's a nice niche, right? Because as you said, it wasn't much looked at then, and it's probably not much looked at now, to be
Yeah, I mean, you could really count on one or two hands the number of researchers, back then who were doing work in this area, actually some great work at that time, high quality work. I would say probably in the last 20 years of my career, 10, 15 years pretty much in obscurity. You would not have invited me on this podcast 10 years ago, because people weren't really talking about, female athletes or using women as participants in their sport and exercise science studies. But I would maybe, if I could use the analogy, that the lights have come on in the last sort of 5 or so years. I think the last Olympics, or certainly starting with the Rio Olympics and then the last Tokyo Olympics, made a big difference, because we're sort of inching towards parity in participation at the Olympic level between men and women. That's really sort of driven some attention, much needed attention, and focus onto female athletes. Now, Glenn, I should say, before we really get diving into any of these topics, today, I just want to clarify some of the language I use, because I think that's quite important. I'm going to be talking about cisgender women. That's my area. So looking at the ovarian hormones in cisgender women. I tend to use female as an adjective and women as a noun. And so that's sort of the language that I'm going to use today. So just to be clear on that.
Good. Yes, that's important to clarify. I was thinking as well that probably 10 years ago, which is interesting you said 10 years, because up until then, I hadn't looked at any of the research. Okay, to be honest, the research I did was usually in males, and with grant applications, you'd say, well, the National Health and Medical Research Council here would have a question, and it would say, are you including males and females? And if not, why not? And and at that point, it was sort of like almost like just a formality or something. You'd say, oh, you're doing it in males because you want to do it in males first, and it's harder to control in females, or etc. And then you'd move on. But then, and there was a little bit known that there's differences in, so my main area, like metabolism during exercise. But then probably 10 years ago, as you said, it started to be the case. You'd see almost everything. People, okay, not almost everything, but you'd say, hang on, that's different, that's different, that's different. You'd see so many talks and things would be different. And it's, it's very clear that, it's not just sort of around the periphery that there might be differences between males and females, but it's definitely, that. I'm not telling you anything.
Yeah, I mean, the non-reproductive functions of the ovarian hormones, are it's a long list, and actually, theoretically, potentially have the capacity to change or influence or alter all of the physiological systems, and then sort of synchronous changes, and how does that look for performance? And so, I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered. But actually, Mandy Hagstrom and her colleagues wrote a really nice piece a couple of years ago now, actually addressing that type of mentality. So if you read a paper and it says, the effect of such and such a supplement in runners, you would assume that research was conducted in men, because it feels like the default. So when you don't specify the sex of the participants in the title, it defaults to men. And so asking and sort of discussing the possibility and the potential of, well, what if we move forward now in a way where we do specify the sex, so we don't default to men, given, of course, that women are half the population of the world. And, things like that could actually make a huge difference. And again, if you're writing your paper, and actually long before you write it, when you sit to design your study, to really think about, why am I not using women as participants? Could I? If so, what would that look like? Because I think now so many journals are moving their policies towards, why have you not used them? And if you can't give a rationale, and of course you're not, by the time you come to publish the paper, you're not looking for some sort of retrospective, as you say, sort of tick box of, oh, I didn't use women for this reason. It should be, as you set out to design it. And so if we can change our culture and look for ways to be more inclusive as using women as participants, I think there's a lot that can be done there. So that's a really nice paper. It's worth looking at for sort of genuine ways to change our culture, our mindset, and to actually, I think, because if you can open your study up to women, it really helps with recruitment, right? And some of the other difficulties we have. Exactly. But of course, it goes back to my original point. We need to train sports scientists about female endocrinology, physiology, so they know if they can and how to do that.
Yeah, and the other thing you were saying about funding and recruitment is is part of the reason you'd say you weren't involving women was because, you know, you would then have to have double your N. You know, that was part of the rationale. But the other thing, I guess, was a bit of a, you know, I had Abby Smith Ryan on here a few months ago.
Love Abby.
Yeah. And one of the things that sort of slowly like dropped into my head was the fact that usually I'd be thinking about it, and I guess a lot of people would be thinking about, if you have a study with women, it's because you're comparing the males to the females. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. There's obviously a whole field of just women's physiology independent. You don't have to have, oh, how does that compare to males? Because, you know, which is what we're talking about today. Yeah.
I mean, I have never done a sex difference study. In fact, I am well known for saying, I don't know how to do sex difference studies, to which people go, well, it's really simple, Kirsty, you compare men and women. But my point is, I don't know which type of woman to compare to that set of men, because my area and my research focus is comparing different types of women. Now, when I say that, that sounds very odd, but what I mean is different types of women to me are women with different ovarian hormone profiles. So like you said, the menstrual cycle may be compared to a particular type of hormonal contraception, pregnancy versus postpartum, pre and post menopause. And so that's where I'm working, the sort of within women comparisons. And so when faced with, how do you conduct a sex difference study? I'm like the rabbit in the headlights. I'm like, I don't know which type of woman I would compare to the man. So I have never done sex difference studies. I'm very much interested in within women differences.
Exactly. And the topic, it wouldn't make sense with the topic we've got today to be comparing anything to a male. So if we start off, it sort of made sense to me to go through in sort of chronological order, which, you know, menstrual cycle, effect on exercise performance, and then hormonal contraception, then pregnancy, and then menopause. So if we start off, you know, what is the effect of menstrual cycle on exercise performance? What do we know? What do we not know?
$1 million question. Oh my goodness, this is going to be such a frustrating listen for your for your listeners, for your audience. Yeah, I want to say readers. I'm used to saying for papers, but you guys know what I mean. It's going to be frustrating in so much as we don't know very much, which is not great for a discussion. But I think what is very interesting and what might be very helpful to listeners is to explain why we don't know so much and what we can do to fill those knowledge gaps. So if you ask me, how does the menstrual cycle affect performance? I would answer in, I guess, two ways. Let's look at the research evidence, of course. First thing is, there's not a lot of research evidence. We've said that now a number of times. So very little research conducted on menstrual cycle phase and performance. What makes it worse? The quality of the research. So, and it's very much linked to my previous point. If we're not routinely embedding female endocrinology, physiology, differences in biomechanics, psychology, and so on into our sport and exercise curricula, then how do we expect researchers when, like, as you said, you have expertise in metabolism. And so suddenly, if you want to do a study on menstrual cycle and metabolism, where do you get the knowledge on what's a good research design for women, and how do I establish those phases and verify them and so on? And so actually that has really hindered the quality of the research. So I would always say we have insufficient high quality evidence to make a statement on how menstrual cycle phases affect performance. And so moving forward, we need more research, but more high quality work. And more high quality work will only come if we change, as I say, our way. So we stop looking at women as a niche population. Quite often I'm in the session where, you know, it's special populations. And it's like, wow, half of the world, you know, is a special population. Right. And so it's about changing that mindset and training people so that we can do high quality research. So that's one part. So the second part to my answer is, I'm not sure, 20-something years into this area of research, I'm not sure if we will ever get a universal blueprint where we say, this phase of the menstrual cycle has this performance effect, and this phase, and this phase, because of the variability. So in terms of variability, there's variability everywhere. So take cycle length, for example. A normal menstrual cycle can be anywhere between 21 and 35 days. Wow, so that's really difficult to
Okay.
compare between women.
Mm.
Not only does that length vary between women, it varies within a woman. And so if you want to make repeated measurements, performance measurements over a number of cycles, because that would be good science. So rather than just taking a photograph once and saying, well, that's how you're going to look forever, you would want to, you know, of course, track that a little bit. And so even within a woman, her cycle length can vary. So this time her cycle is 27 days, next time 28, 29, 26, 27, 27, 27, 28. And so I say it's like trying to pin the tail on the donkey sometimes, that, you know, trying to get this, you know, to establish the phases in order to make the measurements is very difficult. So that variability is super difficult. And of course, then when faced with sports women, so if you have many practitioners listening and they're saying, okay, you know, but I want to use my research, you know, to inform practice and work with sports women, of course, we can't make the assumption that all women have a menstrual cycle. And actually, you've been terrific from the start of this podcast, mentioning the other profiles. Often in sport, particularly in the media, in the UK, I don't know what it's like worldwide, but the media is obsessed with menstrual cycles. And every female athlete, you know, it's all about her cycle, her performance. And actually, we know, of course, that not all sports women have a menstrual cycle. So throwing that all together, I guess I've said a lot, so I'll summarize it. I don't have a firm answer for you around which phase has which performance effect. We don't know because there's not a lot of research. The research we have is predominantly low to moderate quality, so making it difficult to really have confidence in findings. There's a lot of variability in menstrual cycle characteristics, including cycle length, both within and between women. And then, of course, the last bit, which maybe is the key piece, the symptoms associated with the menstrual cycle are very, you know, can be very different between women. So you'll have some sports women who have no symptoms. They don't know what day of their cycle they're on. You know, okay, they know when they're bleeding, they're menstruating, they have their period, because of course that's quite obvious. But day to day, they don't know whether they're walking around with high estrogen concentrations or low. They're unaffected. But then, of course, you have a smaller group of women, of subset of women who have a lot of symptoms associated with different phases. And so, of course, if you have a lot of symptoms, so for example, maybe as you're menstruating, you have really bad abdominal cramps. Well, those abdominal cramps are going to affect your performance, let's face it. Yeah. So trying to tease out what's a direct biological pathway between, say, high estrogen and a metabolic effect or a cardiovascular effect or a muscular effect versus a change of hormone causing a symptom or side effect, whether that's a physical or a mood-based one, and its effect on performance. Of course, they're not separate pathways, they probably overlap, but it makes it very difficult to study this area. So yeah, very much that sort of pin the tail on that donkey. Maybe, you know, not just blindfolded, but maybe a little tipsy, a little jet lagged. It's very difficult. So that is the very long answer to not telling you any findings, but telling you why we don't have those. So that's sort of where we're at the moment. I guess final sort of thought, if people really want that literature, myself and a great group of researchers, privileged to work with them, recently, I say recently, in my mind it's recently, 2, maybe 3 years ago now, put out a systematic review, a meta-analysis asking what is the effect of menstrual cycle phase on exercise performance. You can read that, it's open access. There was a trend or an indication towards a trivial reduction in performance during the early follicular phase. So actually when an athlete is bleeding, but that was a highly variable response. And as I say, again, from a small number of papers, which were predominantly low to moderate quality. So the conclusion of that systematic review and meta-analysis was, okay, that's what it showed, but we don't have much confidence in that. So therefore, at the moment, we can't give group-based evidence and take an individual approach.
Okay. And I could imagine even within the individual, so even if you had someone who felt that they didn't perform as well during a particular phase, who knows, as you said, the next cycle, it could be 5 days longer, or, you know, they might feel fine that time, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so inconsistent. And so actually I steal a really good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Emma Ross, you know, she really put it nicely, you know, perhaps we will never have, maybe this will be one area of sport and exercise science where we will never have this universal blueprint to give sort of group, you know, sort of more population-based guidelines. It might be one area where it is so individualized, and actually that athlete will really have to track her own cycle characteristics, and then map her performance over time and look for patterns. And as you say, even if you recognize a pattern, if your cycle is slightly longer or shorter, that sort of throws that predictability. If you're trying to use that to get ahead of it. So say you've been doing this piece for, 6 months before the Olympics, it's because you want to try and understand, where will I be, Olympic final, if I make it there, where will I be in my cycle, so I can sort of try and understand how I'm going to feel, how I'm going to perform. But if in that month of the Olympic final, your cycle is longer or shorter, that milestone moves, I say left or right, but it will move days earlier or days later than normal, and then all bets are off. So I'll steal Emma's. Maybe there'll never be a universal blueprint, but it is very much an area that lends itself to individuality.
And I know the next bit we're going to talk about is effective hormonal contraception, but I know I'd heard years and years ago that athletes had tried to manipulate their cycle so that they would be at a particular point for the event, for their race. Is that right?
Yeah, there are certainly anecdotes about, sometimes some very extreme ways of manipulating your hormonal profile for, competitive advantage. We don't really hear much of that anymore. And it's interesting, actually, talking about manipulating cycles. Quite often when you start to talk about oral contraception or any type of hormonal contraception in an athletic setting, people get very sort of caught up in, what is that for performance and so on, and is there an advantage or disadvantage? And they forget it's also for contraceptive purposes. So it's always worth putting that out, because we talk about, we can manipulate. So for example, if you have a very bad experience as you menstruate and you wanted to get rid of, the inconvenience of bleeding, say on the Olympic final, and B, you have very bad cramps. So again, you don't want to, abdominal cramps, for example, and you don't want to experience that on the day of the Olympic final. People talk about, well, they take the oral contraceptive pill to manipulate their cycle. And that certainly is a thing. But I'll always, and I'll repeat myself several times to make the point clear, contraception is still a woman's personal choice and can just be for contraceptive purposes, but there is this other sort of view about manipulation of sort of hormonal profile. So, right, let's answer your question. How do oral contraceptives
Actually, sorry, I was just thinking, can we, before we talk about the oral contraception, hormonal contraception, etc., can we just clarify, partly for my own thinking, the normal sort of hormonal changes during a menstrual cycle? As you said, it's variable.
Absolutely.
And then how
the
oral contraceptives are affecting that. Yeah.
No problem. Right. So let's paint a picture. Let's do some diagrams with words. Yes. So during a typical menstrual cycle, there are, let's say, at least 3 distinct hormonal phases. So where estrogen and or progesterone are significantly different. So at the start of the cycle, day 1 is the first day of bleeding. At day 1 and phase 1, estrogen and progesterone are low. Okay, so let's just do the estrogen one first, and then we'll do the progesterone profile. So estrogen is low at the start of the cycle when you're bleeding, and then it starts to creep up and has its peak just before midway of the cycle. So it peaks usually between 24 hours and 48 hours before ovulation occurs. Then it declines rapidly, but it doesn't go back to that sort of original starting point. It declines, but as it declines, then it begins to rise. In that second half of the cycle, you get a secondary peak, and then it begins to, of course, drop off, so that by the time it gets to the next cycle, it's low again. And now, so if anybody's watching the video, they'll see my finger, it goes low, it has a peak, it comes back down, it has a secondary peak, and then off it goes again. Progesterone is a little simpler, I guess, in terms of explanation. For the first half of the cycle, it stays low. Okay, so it's low when estrogen is at its highest peak. Around halfway, so around the time of ovulation, it begins to creep up. It peaks, I would say, in the latter third of the cycle. And of course, it needs to drop off again in order to instigate the next bleed. And so really the 3 distinct phases are at the start, phase 1, when estrogen and progesterone are low. Phase 2, which is just before ovulation, estrogen is at its highest, progesterone is still low. And then I'm going to go phase 4, and you're going to go, well, where is phase 3? But that's a conversation for another time. But phase 4 is where progesterone is high and estrogen has its secondary peak. And so regardless that I call that phase 4, there are 3 distinct phases. Of course, there are the days in between. You don't just magically jump and arrive at those. But yeah, they're more gradual, the changes in between. So they're the real sort of popping points. Now, to compare that to maybe, say, an oral contraceptive profile. I tend to use oral contraceptive. I know there are lots of different types of hormonal contraceptives. We could be here all day. I will focus on oral ones because they're the most commonly used. And so if you take an oral contraceptive pill, let's go for a combined type, combined meaning that within the pill, there's a synthetic estrogen and progestin. Monophasic in so much as you get the same concentration for all the pill taking days. Okay, so that's what I'm going to describe. Most common type of pill used by athletes. And typically you would take that pill for 21 consecutive days, and then you would either have 7 pill-free days, or in some countries there's 7 placebo pills, but it's the same thing. It's an inactive 7-day period. I shouldn't say period, I should say time frame, because people are, it's not that period, right? So a 7 inactive time frame. And now what happens here? So you've got 2 synchronous profiles. Let's talk about your ovarian hormones first, because it was the ovarian hormones we were talking about in the menstrual cycle. So when you take the oral contraceptive pill, your endogenous ovarian hormone profile is downregulated. Okay, so it will increase a little bit in the 7 pill-free days, but actually even when it sort of creeps a little bit in the 7 pill-free days, it's still only around the same concentration as in phase 1 of the menstrual cycle. So at its highest during the pill is equivalent to the lowest of the menstrual cycle. So it's just so when people see the diagram, they do see estrogen creep up a little bit and they go, oh, look, there's a peak. It's not really a peak. It's, and the scale of the axis is important. So that's your endogenous ovarian hormones. But as I said, in that pill, as you take it, is a synthetic exogenous estrogen and progestin. And when you take your pill, within an hour of consumption, that concentration peaks in the bloodstream, and then it, of course, drops off for the rest of the day, and then you take it again the next day. And so you have some exogenous supplementation at the same time as downregulated endogenous profile. And so if you think about that, it's 21 days of supplementation versus 7 days of none. And so again, if we were thinking about whether or not these hormones affect performance or indicators of performance, such as muscle strength, endurance capacity, whatever it might be, then would we see a change in performance between the supplementation time and none? So actually, when it comes to pill users and looking at their sort of effects on performance, you can do it 2 ways. Almost comparing them against themselves. So pill taking days versus pill free days. And then of course, everybody wants to compare the pill users to the non-pill users and to the menstrual cycle. And so that's sort of the hormonal profiles that you're talking about there, Glenn, in the 2 different groups.
Okay, and the pill itself, you said it's the same the whole way through, but what is it compared? What the actual hormones in it? How does it compare to the normal cycle? Like what's it actually trying to do? Just dampen the whole thing?
Well, it's
stop the estrogen going up.
Goes back. This is it goes back to the point of sort of what is they're for contraception, and so they're designed, of course, to disrupt the fertility cycle so that you don't get pregnant. And of course we tend not to think about it that way. So it's preventing pregnancy by changing the menstrual cycle, which is completely designed. The estrogen rises to help the egg to be produced and delivered, and then the progesterone for thickening the lining of the womb. And so essentially the purpose of the pill and its hormonal changes is to prevent pregnancy from taking place by changing some of these other sort of parts of the reproductive cycle.
But does it keep it just flatline? It stops the estrogen going up, is that basically, or
so endogenous estrogen, is flatlined. Endogenous estrogen, in the example I've given you, as I say, there are lots of different ones, but that's the main type. So you get a down regulation of the endogenous, but as I say, then your body will also respond to the exogenous sort of supplementation of the sort of synthetic ones. But the whole purpose, of course, as we say, is not to manipulate it in such a way to be either advantage or disadvantage for sport. It's to prevent pregnancy.
Exactly. Yeah. I'd like to see. I don't expect you to draw it again, but I'd like to see the actual the graphs of what it looks like with contraception versus not.
I mean, visually, it's very stark. And I think that is the most impactful way, no matter how much I try and describe it with words and draw it with my finger in the air. When you look at it, it's so obvious that they're different. And actually, I find it quite frustrating sometimes. And let's give the example, because I mentioned about poor quality research. I find it frustrating, and actually it's just incorrect, when you read a paper and it says, I'm interested in the effects of menstrual cycle phase on metabolism. I'll go with your work, Glenn. Not your work, but your area. Because please be clear, listeners, I'm not criticizing Glenn's work. But if we took that as an example, menstrual cycle phase and metabolism, you read that paper, and when you look at the description of the participants, it says 7 had, naturally menstruating, and 2 were on the pill, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but if they're on the pill, they don't have a menstrual cycle profile. They don't have menstrual cycle phases. Therefore, that title does not represent who, you cannot mix them. To me, in my mind, and in terms of facts, you may as well have gone, well, let's just throw in a few men and say we're interested in the effects of menstrual cycle phase on this, because their hormonal profile is absolutely different. Another little sort of, I guess, throwaway life lesson learned is when we ask athletes, elite athletes, to complete questionnaires, and we say fill out section A if you use hormonal contraception, fill out section B if you don't. Quite often they fill out both. And it's like, well, it's impossible to be both. I've just described it to you. You cannot be both. The whole point of the pill is to eradicate the menstrual cycle. And they don't know that they're not both. And I think where the misunderstanding has come from is the fact that often people will use the word period for the bleed that happens in the 7 pill-free days. And so these athletes think, well, I get my period when I don't take the pill. So I have menstrual cycle, and the point of it is, it's not a period. I mean, it's very confusing because they're bleeding and bleeding is bleeding, right? But actually it's not. So we would say that in the 7 pill-free days, you get a withdrawal bleed. If you have a menstrual cycle, that's a period. And that might just help. We started off with trying to explain some language. We're really inconsistent. We're a bit loose with our language in this area, but it's very confusing for women themselves. They quite often will describe that bleed as a period. They think they have a menstrual cycle, and you can have both at the same time.
Okay. Well, maybe they get confused because they go, well, I do take it for 21 days, but I don't take it for 7. So, when you say, do you take oral contraception or not? Well, I do and I don't. Okay, so I'm wondering what you think about the effect of this hormone contraception on endurance. I'm getting the feeling you'll say hasn't been well studied and it's difficult to control.
Oh, you see, I told you it'd be a frustrating lesson. It hasn't been well studied. So again, small number of papers, slightly more high quality papers, because actually in terms of if you're going into the laboratory and trying to make these measures, as we said, with the menstrual cycle, it's very hard to predict when they might be in that phase. And then you sort of have to retrospectively confirm they were in that phase. However, with the pill, it's really obvious. I know when you're taking your 21 pill taking days, and I know when you're in the 7 pill free. And so it lends itself, you need a little less knowledge around chronobiology, pharmacology, all of this sort of thing, reproductive physiology, endocrinology. You need less knowledge in order to be able to sort of conduct high quality studies. So yeah, let's go with that. So I mentioned that we did a systematic review and meta-analysis on menstrual cycle phase and exercise performance. We did at the same time the same systematic review and meta-analysis on oral contraceptive pills and performance. So again, open access, you guys can read it for free. Outside of those issues with quality and quantity, there didn't appear to be any difference in performance or in markers of performance, surrogate markers of performance between pill taking and pill-free days. And actually, I know we have a real thing in science at the moment about negative findings and all of that, and I really don't understand what the issue is. I find that information really liberating, because actually if you are a female athlete and you use the pill, that's great to know that we don't at the moment believe there's any difference in your performance. So I love the fact that there's no directional magnitude.
Absolutely. If anyone's watched more than one or two of my podcasts, they know that's like a broken record of me. This idea that negative finding is not a good thing. I mean, it depends what your question is, and it is what it is, and then maybe someone else won't go out and do it. But if you're saying, does exercise performance is affected by oral contraception or not, and you find it's not, well, that's it's just on negative finding. That's the
Yeah,
whole idea.
absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you wanted to know the other piece, so because as I say, we tend to look at pill taking days against pill-free days, but of course people really want to know, well, how does that work in comparison to the menstrual cycle? So we also conducted that type of analysis. Here again, we get very caught up in the variability. So there was a slight indication towards pill users having a trivial reduction in performance compared to the menstrual cycle athletes. But actually that finding was so inconsistent, so variable, that again, we concluded at this time, we wouldn't make any recommendation or guidance based on the literature to date. And again, we would take an individual approach. I mean, it's a most common asked question, Glenn, at conferences or working with athletes, you know, is, well, I was going to tell you the question, but actually maybe this is more interesting. I was once asked at a conference, should we ban oral contraceptive use because it's an ergogenic aid in sport? So that's sort of taking the question I was going to mention and pushing it to the limit. To which, of course, the sensible answer is, of course not. It's a woman's right to choose contraception. Secondly, I don't know what research evidence you're reading, but that's not what I'm seeing. You know, for sure, if by taking the pill, it allows you to train and compete, you know, where otherwise you'd be in bed because you had such debilitating side effects. Yes, of course, that is, you know, a really positive, but it's not an unfair advantage. You know, you're not talking about it's, you know, taking performance and increasing it. It's actually taking you from a state of ill health to a state of, I can get out of bed and I can go and train. So certainly not to that effect. If on the flip side, you said to me, well, should we ban them because actually they're reducing performance? Again, I would say no, because an unplanned pregnancy will definitely disrupt your performance more than, you know, I'm taking the pill. And again, I think that, you know, even the response to taking the pill or different types of hormonal contraceptives, you know, if you do have any side effects of taking a particular type, you can always change to a different one. And actually, that's something that women are quite bad at. So at the moment, I'm reading and seeing, and actually in my own research, athletes reporting lots of side effects associated with oral contraceptive use, to which my reply is, remember, you don't have the cyclical profile, so you shouldn't be experiencing predictable pattern-driven symptoms. So maybe we put something in your mind there that's, you know, sort of a placebo type thing. And secondly, if you do have symptoms and side effects, change it, try a different one. But we do get a little bit caught up in, well, that was the one I prescribed and I just went off and I've been taking it for 20 years. And it's like, well, you can go back and ask. I mean, it is like the variety of types you can take. And, you know, maybe your sister likes this one and it really works for her, and your friend likes this one, but it doesn't mean that it'll work for you. So yeah, I think there's still a piece there around an individual approach, working with athletes to find the best type of hormonal contraception for them.
Okay. And I imagine if it's not that clear, the effect on exercise performance, you probably can't break it down then, because I was going to say, what about sprint type exercise? What about team sports? What about strength? What about endurance? I guess you haven't got that.
We had the data for that. Yeah, I mean, I would love to be talking to that level of detail. I mean, even in those systematic reviews, Glenn, you know, we called it exercise performance. We had such a variety there under that one term, because actually we had strength-based measures, we had endurance-based measures, we had, you know, actual performance tests, all mixed in there. And we were still only sort of hitting around, you know, 50 papers for one, 70 papers for another. So we're nowhere near that detail. I would default then in that instance and saying, you know, talk to some sprinters and let's find out, you know, and because people say, oh, you want anecdotal evidence, Kirsty, that's, you know, gosh, 1 minute you're talking about high quality research and the next minute you're talking about anecdotal evidence. And I would say that let's reframe anecdotal evidence in this space and let's call it the lived experiences of these athletes. Because if you truly want to understand if a particular phase is affecting sprint performance, then I think you're going to have to go to a sprinter and say, let's track your cycle, let's map your performance against that, and let's look for patterns before we can really answer that question. I think we'll get answers from applied sport more quickly than we will from laboratory studies, because it is going to have to take some sort of, you know, gigantic effort for this sport and exercise science community to really get behind this now and start to pump out, you know, well-powered, not underpowered studies, 5, 7 women are just not going to cut it. I'm talking, big numbers, very, refined methodologies, and, starting then to go, I think I would actually probably start where you are, the aspects of performance before going to overall sort of performance on a whole.
Okay, and I like to make sure my Twitter followers are happy. So I asked for questions. So I've got one here kind of related to this. I think I know what the answer is going to be. But Mark Preben Lindbeck, does the differences in menstrual cycle and hormonal contraception from short-term studies translate into long-term differences and performance tests or chances of winning competitions? And I think we've probably answered that, but
no, we don't know that. I think a thing to point out, particularly about menstrual cycles, so cycle characteristics change pretty much every 5 or so years. So, definitely, it's a very good point, actually. It's a clever question around, how does the short term translate into long term? So the answer is we don't know, bearing in mind for those who are non-hormonal contraceptive users, their cycle characteristics can change over time. So yeah, we're not there yet. I think often I'm asked, well, I've used the pill for 20 years, what's the implication of that? We don't know. We don't have longitudinal studies. We're just about holding on to a few observational, cross-sectional studies. We don't have a beautiful longitudinal data set.
Fair enough.
I think what this question has shown, though, again, if we could change the culture at the athletic level, where people are tracking and mapping their performance and cycle characteristics, they'd probably be able to answer that and say, well, actually, as I was sort of, post-puberty and my cycle was sort of still sorting itself out, this is how my performance was, during that first stage of adulthood. I felt I had a time of stability. Then if you throw in a pregnancy, how did that affect it, and so on? I think that therein highlights, you said at the start, let's go in chronological order. I think that was a really nice way to put it, because actually, the time between post-puberty and menopause and menopause itself, there are a lot of lifespan changes there in ovarian hormone profiles, and you just don't have the equivalent in men. And so while people go, oh, that's super complicated, and for me, that's super interesting. So again, how you can easily make women your life's work. So yeah, great question. I'm sorry I don't have a great answer for that, but hopefully, actually, I would imagine that he would be able to have answered that question by now himself from listening to.
That's why I still wanted to ask it, because it's a good question, but I think we already knew the answer. But it was still good to discuss. All right, so if we can move on perhaps to pregnancy and exercise performance. So yeah.
Well, that's great. Okay, let me tell you about pregnancy performance. So historically, we haven't studied a lot of exercise performance measures during pregnancy. This time for different reasons, mostly from an ethical and sort of health and safety viewpoint. Obviously, some eyebrows raised around getting pregnant women to do, various tests that we would be otherwise quite comfortable using in a sport and exercise sort of environment. That culture is definitely changing, and I'm seeing some nice bits of work coming out now. Actually, Margie Davenport and her group are really pushing now some great guidelines around, how to exercise safely. So I know that's not exactly what you asked me, but I think one is sort of, has to be coupled with the other. Until we really understand how to exercise safely during pregnancy, it somewhat limits our ability to then go on and test performance and some of those things. I think what I will answer to you is links back to what you asked me earlier. What is the hormonal profile during pregnancy? Because to understand that then would help us to understand potential performance changes. So actually, very simply, menstrual cycle is eradicated, so you don't get this cyclical peaks and troughs. Estrogen and progesterone rise. It's lovely. It's so easy to explain. I don't even need a picture. Okay. They rise throughout the trimesters, and are very high at by the end of pregnancy, and then they drop off quite significantly upon delivery. And then again, there's a little bit of variability here. So for some women, their menstrual cycle pattern returns quite quickly after giving birth. But if you breastfeed, you might end up with what we call lactational amenorrhea. So you don't get the cyclical profile. You get a flat line. because of this, as I say, lactational amenorrhea. And so again, just being careful from a research perspective that if you're trying to take measures in the postpartum time, you establish if they have a return of menstrual cycle, if they're amenorrheic, and so on. So the story there would be, okay, I would describe the hormonal changes during pregnancy as super physiological, because they're just so in excess of what you see in the menstrual cycle. So again, quite a visual one. If the changes are this big in the menstrual cycle, they're this big in pregnancy, you know.
So we say 10, maybe what you were showing was sort of like 10% versus 100%, like probably 10 times higher.
I think don't hold me to the exact number, but something like estrogen is something like 75 times higher in pregnancy.
Okay.
So, you know, the really profound differences. And so herein we would look at, okay, well, these super physiological levels of estrogen and progesterone, how did they affect performance? Now, as I say, completely limited by what we do. We don't tend to do laboratory studies like that. I'm only aware of a handful. I've conducted one or two myself. Actually, one of my PhD studies was around, so a long time ago, looked at different stages of pregnancy against a muscle strength measure. And actually, we didn't see, you know, as we had these significant changes, increases in estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy, we weren't seeing corresponding changes in muscle strength alongside that. So the honest answer is we don't know. We're not taking that model into sport and exercise science a lot. Interestingly, you didn't ask me this question, but pregnancy is one model of super physiological hormonal changes. In vitro fertilization treatment is another. So it's another way to test, you know, profound, you know, changes in these hormones. And personally, I've just lucky Professor Tony Hackney invited me to be part of an article he was writing, and we're trying to encourage people to use both of these super physiological models to test some, you know, aspects of performance or strength or endurance and so on. And so we obviously looked at studies within that. And as I say, we've gone from in the tens for menstrual cycle and oral contraceptives to in the single digits for, you know, really a handful of studies. So great question. I would say the emphasis right now is exercising safely during pregnancy. And of course, what we're seeing now are more elite female athletes experiencing pregnancy during their careers rather than waiting till the end of their careers to have babies. So again, I would say the applied setting will give us data more quickly than laboratories, because actually if we're clever and we look to collect data in real time in the field from these athletes, then we'll begin to understand the effects of pregnancy much more.
Yeah, so have people done questionnaires on these questions? So, you know, asking people, do you feel like you perform better at different phases of the menstrual cycle? Do you think you perform better or worse on oral contraception? You know, how do you feel like you perform while you're pregnant, after you know, people done questionnaires on that? Because I'm just thinking about, you know, like you said, with the anecdotal.
Yeah, there are questionnaires on that. I mean, I've done some questionnaires myself. I'm going to be really honest. Every time I go back and I read my own study, and I'm really going to talk about myself now, I'm not criticizing anybody else. Always after the fact, I think this questionnaire is not fit for purpose. And I personally have never validated a questionnaire in this space. It's something I would love to do, but to my knowledge, you know, there are not really sort of, you know, validated fit for purpose questionnaires, you know, that are being routinely used in this area, whether it's menstrual cycle, pregnancy, or so on. And so that is, of course, going to limit our capacity. I do wonder in my mind a little bit about, you know, that sort of, I'm calling it a placebo effect. It's not the right word. Sorry, I'm a little ineloquent today, which is not good for a podcast. But I wonder that once we start in these questionnaires to really throw a lot of symptoms and feelings and things, are we putting a thought in people's minds? And so I would argue that that questionnaire is only useful if you're using it in athletes who are tracking and mapping. Because otherwise, on the day, if you start saying to somebody, you know, how does this make you feel? It's recall, it's I do struggle. And as I say, I'm not being critical of anybody else's work. I'm quite happy to be critical of my own. And I don't love the questionnaire studies that I've done. And I mean, questionnaires, it's an area in itself. But for me personally, I'm looking for some more objective measures that I can do in the laboratory.
Well, that's the way I normally think, and I could see that's the way you think as well. But just when you've got the situation where it's almost like a lot of it's anecdotal, and it would be nice to sort of ask a whole bunch of, you know, athletes, you know, how did they find this and that? But as you say, it's hard to design a questionnaire. All right, and then the other obvious one is, after pregnancy. So after you've had a child, hopefully, a child, how have people performed? So, we all know lots of stories about people that have, won gold medals and won, Australian Opens and after having a child. But I guess it's a hard one to control because the person's getting older and wiser, I guess, at the same time. So what do you know about that?
What do I know about that? I think there are sort of great stories, great examples, as you say, of success, which I think they should be highlighted, because I think we want women to have children within their career and not till the end. And I think that it's the return to sport is the interesting one. The flip side of the big successes are the people who've been injured in that time. So, for example, are ligaments looser in that time? Are there changes to bone health? Linked again with not just the hormonal changes in pregnancy, but that lactational amenorrhea and so on. So, yes, let's highlight the success stories. Let's not convince all women that they should be outrunning marathons a week after having a baby. That would, we have to be sensible, because of course media pick up on these things and go, well, look, they won Olympic gold, and so therefore all women should be out doing this. So let's be sensible. Absolutely, there's the possibility, and if we do it right, I would say the very high likelihood of getting elite sportswomen back to where they were in a very reasonable time frame, in terms of just focus on that return and really work with professionals in that space, because there are, again, some profound changes, not just to hormone concentrations, center of gravity shifts, your organs are displaced during pregnancy, the weight gain, the weight loss, all of those things, the sleep deprivation, so it's a real time of change. And so I would say that brilliant. Love to hear the successes. It is absolutely possible. Let's be sensible and let's not expect every woman to do all of this. I think the message here is really focus on the return portion and what that looks like with professionals. But I don't see it. If you were asking me, do I think it's career ending? Absolutely not, would be my answer.
Oh, no. I was more thinking, how do have people done studies to see, the 100-meter runner, what times they do before a child versus after a child, or if people have done comparison of this, and it's probably so many factors there, right? Pardon.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's almost impossible to make that comparison. Because unless somebody whisks your baby away the day it's born and looks after it for you, and you don't have to get up in the night, and you're not breastfeeding, and you're not doing all this, that, and the other, and your schedule hasn't changed, and you can train as you were, I think it's almost impossible to make that comparison, and if you make that comparison, well, here was a year before the baby and a year after, then is there, have you really picked up on the effects of that pregnancy, or has they've been washed out to a certain extent at that point? So I don't know how you would make that comparison in a meaningful way, because, certainly in the short term, where you might pick up on some of those physiological or emotional changes associated with pregnancy, that's not fair. And by the time you could make a more like-for-like comparison, they're probably gone, and then you're just looking at before and after thing.
Yeah, so as you said, it's so many variables, in a woman after giving birth, having a baby, less time, maybe sleep deprived. But I was wondering if they, if people have looked to see if the mother actually trains more efficiently after having a child, having less time, maybe they do more intense exercise, haven't got time for the long, slow distance,
My goodness. Well, if such a paper exists, I've not read it. So although I feel like now we're all going to go, great idea, Glenn, there's our next study designed.
There you go.
We're going to be watching them. But I mean, it's a credible point, right? If you've got less time, how do you adapt your training to that? Did you see recently, the authors escape me, which is quite rude, but there was a really nice piece published recently around case studies and their use. And for some people, they really don't value case studies, but again, I think if we keep going back to the variability here within women and all of these profiles we're talking about, I think there could be some really nice impactful case studies done here around when they return, because we're so obsessed with what happens during pregnancy, but when they return, what does training look like, at least in that first instance?
Yeah. Another funny thought I had was whether the woman, the mother would actually have a better pain threshold after having a child, because I remember a few times we've done a whole bunch of biopsy studies, yeah, and at one stage I was doing people with type 2 diabetes versus controls, and we had males and females, and when you do the biopsies, the females that had children said this is like nothing compared to childbirth, and which is, I totally agree. Well, I can't comment on that directly, but I can imagine seeing my wife she had no input, didn't even take a paracetamol, Panadol, nothing for our 2 girls. So I can vouch for the fact that she was in more pain than the average biopsy person. But I wonder if they get a better pain threshold or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There again is another interesting piece, but you're not the first person to say that would be quite a common conversation. And again, a really fascinating piece of work. I remember actually doing a biopsy study with elderly participants versus much younger ones, and actually the elderly participants were much more tolerant of muscle biopsies. So well, I don't know if it's a combination of sex and age or your own personal circumstances, but no, there may well be something in that.
It's funny you say that, because as I was saying it, I was thinking actually the older males as well, they weren't worried either, but the older females that had babies, they definitely didn't care about it. They're like, this is nothing. Right, so I guess it's a good little entrance into menopause, because we're talking about older people there. So what about the effect of menopause on exercise? And I can see already, I think I know what you're thinking. On exercise performance.
So when I said it was a frustrating listen, and now the people are going to know it's a repetitive listen. But no, here I'll say, in terms of the menopause, that actually not being a lot of research focus here, again for slightly different reasons, because when a population, women are underrepresented within the research anyway, you tend to sort of focus on the most common. So if we're thinking about athletes, we're thinking more about sort of adulthood, so post-puberty and definitely pre-menopause. And so we haven't really sent any of that sort of limited focus or funding or resources to a sort of an older master's postmenopausal group. Again, in terms of the hormonal profile, because I know you're going to ask me that, I'm going to get ahead of it this time and say that, again, the menstrual cycle, that repeating pattern that we spoke about, or indeed if they were oral contraceptive users, it changes. And so how would I describe that with words? I guess if you were to look at it retrospectively, look back at it, it goes from the pattern of peaks and troughs, and it looks like a very smooth slope, and again ending in down regulation. So a flat line then that remains post-menopause for the rest of the lifespan. That's looking back at it, sort of smooth. It's a sort of smooth line and slope. As you're going through it, there is nothing smooth and eloquent about that decline. So it's a very unpredictable time. And so if I were drawing it, and which I have often done in a sort of a presentation, I would have the nice repeating pattern of the menstrual cycle. Then I'd literally draw a chaos ball, and then I have that retrospective decline, which looks very nice. Because in truth, hormones really start to go haywire during that perimenopausal time. Cycle lengths, so people say, well, how do you know you're perimenopausal? For some women, their cycles will get very short. But for some women, their cycles will get much longer. So how are we sort of homogenizing
that variation within people again?
Yes. Yeah? It's very unpredictable. And so some women's cycles get much shorter and others get much longer. And so again, trying to conduct reductionistic, tightly controlled laboratory studies becomes almost impossible, because trying to find women with the same experience that can all come to the lab around a similar time is difficult. With the menopause as a transitional phenomenon is very difficult. It's again a very retrospective thing, because post-menopause, the definition of that is when the woman has been amenorrheic for 12 months or more. And so of course, if you're doing a laboratory study, that's easy. It's an easy criteria to put on your poster and your recruitment material. Please come to the lab, and if you're post-menopausal, and you get a nice homogeneous group and then you can look at the effects of down-regulated estrogen and progesterone on different measures. But of course, we really want to look at the menopausal transition. But as I say, in terms of a methodological approach, that can be difficult because some cycles are shorter and longer. And here we go again with the symptoms. And so perhaps maybe people are aware more of the menopausal symptoms. Maybe they're more spoken about than maybe menstrual cycle symptoms have been. But, you know, there are hot flushes or hot flashes, they call them in America, which are, you know, debilitating. You know, we're not talking about, you know, oh, I feel a little hot today. We're talking about, you know, really genuine, you know, overcome with heat and, you know, night sweats, all sorts of things, changes in mood, actually to the point of almost psychosis, the changes in mood. You know, we're not talking about, oh, I feel a little down today, you know, talking about genuine depression, psychosis, all sorts of things. And so again, we would wonder here in this menopausal phase and looking at menopausal participants, alongside these changes in hormones where they're all starting to be disrupted and eventually going to decline, that overlaid with the symptoms and side effects, what are their effects on performance? Now I'm going to hear just, I have no really studies to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the lived experiences. It would appear at the moment, and as I say, very happy to be challenged on this. People can take to Twitter and let me know. But from certainly the groups that I've been working with, it appears that women who have been active, have been athletes themselves for a large portion of adulthood and keep being active into that menopausal and postmenopausal transition, seem to have less symptoms associated with menopause, and seem to be less affected in some ways. So they don't tend to see such profound changes to their performance, whereas those who have, you know, been non-athletic, more sedentary, not regular even exercises, are tending to have more severe symptoms and therefore would almost be impacted more if they were to try and sort of go for a run, you know, or do a gym session and so on. Now, as I said, that's just been somewhat limited. I'm sharing my experiences here. The research questions in my mind are, do athletes enter menopause sooner or later than non-athletes? Again, so usually if you enter it earlier, so typical menopausal range is between 45 and 55, but most being sort of 50 to 55. So do they enter it earlier or later? Those who enter early tend to have longer ones. So again, I'm interested in, you know, in an athletic population, how long is that menopausal transition? And again, the severity and occurrence of symptoms. So there are some of the research questions I would like answered. And then to look at, again, as I say, these effects on performance, and looking at that sort of more, I hope it's fine to call them master athletes. I mean, actually, I don't work with master athletes. So I don't know if there's a, you know, please feel free to correct me here. If there's a definition, it's over the age of whatever. And so given that some women transition to menopause around age 45, I'm not sure if they would quite reach the definition of masters, but I can say reproductive aging rather than maybe just chronological aging.
It's actually very depressing what the masters is like 30. You can compete in the World Masters games after 35.
Wow, I did not know that. That
really
is younger
depressing.
than I thought. I'm quite depressed with myself.
Yeah, so the people that have like the Masters world record, the marathon, something like 36. But wow. Yeah, and then you have veterans, and even that's not that. I think it's depressing. Now, I was wondering if anyone's looked at, so obviously with age, because it becomes difficult looking at, you know, what's the aging effect, what's the menopause effect. Yeah. If people looked at, for example, VO to max, you know, goes down about, I don't know, 1% per year or something like that. And, you know, strength, power, etc. Has anyone looked at, just irrespective of what age the menopause occurred at, whether there's like a change in that line, you know, does it drop faster or less, or do you know, has anyone done that?
Honestly, I don't know. And I think that's okay to say publicly. I don't know. I would say that the menopause is the profile that I'm least familiar with, the body of literature. What I would say, and I'm going to throw, you know, because you know me, I love my methodological approach. I would like to see some studies which compare, and maybe this might help answer the research question as opposed to the question you specifically asked. You can have surgical menopause in much younger women. So they end up with the same hormonal
Okay.
profile as a postmenopausal woman. And I think they would be some, really nice, eloquent studies where you look at sort of surgical menopause in younger women versus postmenopausal in older women. And I wonder if that would help us tease out some of the age-related aspects that you're speaking about. But yeah, it's an area I have to admit I wouldn't know well enough to give a decent answer.
Fair enough. All right, so there is a Twitter question. This might be a bit of a hard one, I'm not sure. Mind to motion, strategies to maintain muscle mass after menopause. So, because I mean, estrogen does have a bit of a bodybuilding effect, yeah? Not bodybuilding, an anabolic effect. So is it fair to say that after menopause, I think the assumption here is that you're losing muscle mass quicker after menopause. And what are the strategies to stop that? I don't know if you know that or.
No, so at the moment, sort of involved with some nice sort of scoping reviews into, best exercise interventions in that postmenopausal state. But again, given sort of the ages that we're potentially talking about, starting at age 45, I would like to err on the side of being rather hopeful that we can do some nice strength work
Absolutely.
in, late 40s. It's, it's not the end. But no, I would say that we may not have hit upon the best training strategies. And again, I wonder with this question, are we talking about people who were historically sedentary or sort of recreationally active to the
people in their 90s can do weight training. Yeah. So yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
It's silly the
so
way
I'm gonna go with, yeah, we'll be fine. we can overcome.
Okay, so we've had a good chat here. Might start thinking about wrapping things up. What are you working on at the moment? What are you excited about? What do you think sort of needs to be done? I guess we've talked about that a bit.
So what I'm working on projects around different hormonal profiles, as you might imagine. I think what excites me at the moment is taking some of the lessons I've learned over the last 20 something years, lessons, and I've got a great group of colleagues and collaborators who have been generous to share their sort of experiences with me too. So what excites me is increasing the quality of the research. And so I'm trying to design studies that are, we talk about gold standards. Who sets the gold standards? What are they? So I'm trying to work to that level. And, those studies are time consuming, resource, intensive. And so I'm looking to do sort of studies with much bigger numbers within them, and looking at making measurements over a number of cycles, because then that might help us a little bit with within even variability, looking at really tracking and establishing those sort of profiles before even taking any measures. So participants will be working with me for probably 6 to 9 months for a study, between tracking and then the sort of laboratory work over various cycles. So I'm looking to push the boundaries. That's what excites me, to push the boundaries, increase that sort of quality. The other thing that I'm sort of working on that excites me is education. And actually, I never thought that would be on my remit. But actually, I'm working a lot with athletes at the moment and sort of support staff, so practitioners, and trying to make some of what we've spoken about today meaningful to them. It's a lot, right? We've spoken for a decent amount of time here today, and I imagine that the majority of your listeners probably already have a little bit of background knowledge or certainly keen interest. And so it's taking, there are different types of listeners. So it's taking the information and trying to make it relevant for the athlete, day to day. And so, yeah, I'm working a lot in sort of education awareness and translating what we know or what we don't know into that applied setting, and actually trying to develop a pipeline from them. And I mentioned it a few times today, the pipeline from them back to me. So can I see your data? Let's do this in applied sport, and let's use your data now to make some of this. Because although I really love my reductionistic, tightly controlled, high quality laboratory work, I want both. So I'm very greedy. I'm a greedy geek.
Fair enough. And this is translation, as you say, doing this podcast. So thanks for that, getting the message out to people. All right. So what about just if we finish up with some key sort of takeaway, bottom line messages from this chat?
Okay. Bottom line. remember that not all sportswomen have menstrual cycles. So maybe we could stop defaulting just to menstrual cycles synonymous with women. So let's think more. Let's think about all the different types of ovarian hormone profiles that they might encounter and start to pay them attention. Other key messages is variability is everywhere here. And maybe I think we do need to push on with the research. I'm not out of the research. I don't feel I've reached the point where I've gone, no, it's impossible. But maybe for once, keeping in our mind that there may not be a universal blueprint. I don't think we're there yet to conclude that, but let's research more, but actually think about the possibility that this is one where we have to go absolutely individual by individual. So lots of variability. Not to maybe confuse, I don't know how to put this. People, like you said at the start, are maybe a bit scared about researching with women. They see it as being something overly complicated. It's not complicated when you know it. So let's teach people about it so they know it and they feel comfortable with it. And maybe that complication will become, wow, this is super interesting. You know, the nuances here, the changes across time and lifespan are super interesting. So yeah, I get a little bit frustrated by it's too complicated to do it. And I guess maybe final word is to work on the education, not just of the athletes and practitioners, but of the scientists and researchers. I guess for some people, they find me a little bit offensive when I talk about the quality of research. I'm including my own research in there. You know, some of my studies have been classified by different other authors as moderate quality. So, you know, we can all do better. And I hold myself to those high standards. But, you know, in the same breath, I am here to help anybody who wants to learn how to do it better. And so, you know, we've started to develop some papers which give some guidance. They're not rules on methodological approaches. So probably last and final word, key message is to do better, to educate our researchers, our scientists, the athletes and the practitioners.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been great. And I think it is exciting, and there's nothing wrong with having areas that aren't clear and need more research. That's you know, plenty of careers there that hopefully people want to get into. So thanks again for coming on.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Anytime.
Okay. See you. Bye. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, subscribe, pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Check out the other podcasts. Thanks again.